Hey everyone, welcome back to Corporate Decoder, the place where we decode the confusing world of corporate filings and let you in on the secrets companies try to hide in plain sight or maybe just bury in a lot of legal corp, and a filing that signals a new investment, but let's see what that really means for the company and its shareholders. Alright, so picture this: Avalon GloboCare wanted to raise some cash, and on July 14th of 2025 they inked a deal with an investor, Brownstone Capital Limited. This agreement is basically a contract where Avalon agreed to sell a mix of things to this investor. First up, they're selling over 121,000 shares of their common stock. Now, common stock is just like regular ownership in the company, the kind you might buy on the stock market. Avalon GloboCare's common stock trades under the ticker ALBT on the Nasdaq Capital Market. But that's not all. Along with these shares, they're also selling something called pre-funded warrants. Think of a warrant like an option or a ticket that gives the holder the right, but not the obligation, to buy more shares at a certain price later on. These specific warrants are pre-funded, meaning they're designed to be exercised immediately, essentially acting like shares from the get-go for the most part. And these particular warrants are for a hefty chunk of shares, over 35,000. So why would Avalon do this? Well, they needed money, and this investor is giving them $475,500. This is a pretty direct way to get cash into the company, and given the short time frame for some of the follow-up actions, it seems like a quick infusion. Now, while the deal was agreed upon on July 14th, it actually closed a few days later, on July 17th. And when the dust settled, after paying off some costs related to the deal, Avalon GloboCare walked away with actually $450,500 in their bank account. That's a pretty normal deduction of fees for this kind of transaction. Here's where it gets a bit more technical, but is super important for the investor. Avalon has to promise to register these shares and the shares that the warrants can be converted into. This is done through a registration statement like a Form S1, which basically tells the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, all the details about the shares being offered. It's a legal requirement. Avalon has to get this registration statement filed pretty quickly. They have two deadlines, and they have to meet the earlier one. One deadline is tied to another filing they have, a Forms S4, which is for mergers and acquisitions, but here it's used to set a timing trigger. Essentially, they have to get this new registration done 15 days after that S4 is approved. If that doesn't happen, they have until September 26, 2025 to get the registration statement filed. And it's not enough just to file it, they also have to make a really good effort to get the SEC to approve it, or declare it effective within 30 days of them filing it. If the SEC decides to review it closely, that timeline can stretch to 75 days. This is all about making sure the investor can eventually sell these shares or use the warrants without running into more legal hurdles. Now, this part is in item 3.02, and it explains the legal basis for this sale. These shares and warrants haven't gone through the full formal registration process with the SEC, and that's allowed because they're relying on an exemption called Section 4 Ante 2. This exemption is generally for private placements, meaning they're selling directly to a sophisticated investor, not to the general public. This is a common way for companies to raise capital quickly without the lengthy and expensive registration process, but it does mean the investor is taking on more of the risk. This filing also mentions another event that happened around the same time. On July 15th, the day after the purchase agreement was signed, Avalon issued over 15,000 shares of common stock to a note holder who converted their debt into equity. This is also a way to raise capital or restructure debt, and this conversion increased the total number of shares Avalon had outstanding to almost 3 million, not counting the shares and warrants they just sold to Brownstone Capital. This is important because more shares outstanding means each existing share represents a smaller piece of the company. This is called dilution, and it can affect the value of each share if the company's overall value doesn't grow proportionally. The filing also lists the exhibits, which are the actual legal documents. We have the warrants themselves as Exhibit Form 1, the Securities Purchase Agreement as Exhibit 10.2. These are the full contracts that detail all the terms and conditions. And finally, the report is signed off by Luisa Ingargiola, who holds the important title of Chief Financial Officer. CFOs are the ones ultimately responsible for the company's financial reporting, so her signature here signals that the company stands behind the information presented in this document. Now let's zoom out and think about what this all means. Avalon GloboCare is raising money, which is generally a good sign that they are trying to grow or manage their finances. They're selling equity and warrants, which is a common fundraising strategy, especially for companies that might not have the easiest time accessing traditional bank loans. The fact that they're offering registration rights to the investor is a positive for that investor, as it makes it easier for them to eventually cash out their investment. However, the need to rely on private placements and private sales rather than public offerings can sometimes indicate that the company might be facing challenges in the public markets or that they're trying to move quickly. The dilution from these new shares is also a key factor for existing shareholders to watch. The company's direction seems to be focused on securing necessary funding for its operations, or growth initiatives, a pretty universal goal for most businesses. But the specific details of how they're doing it through warrants and private placements suggest they're operating in a market environment where speed and flexibility are key, even if it means slightly less favourable terms or potential shareholder dilution. The key risk here is whether the capital raised will be effectively deployed to generate sufficient returns to offset the dilution. The key risk here is whether the capital raised will be effectively deployed to generate sufficient returns to offset the dilution and justify the investors' involvement. An opportunity lies in the potential for the company to utilise this fresh capital for strategic advancements, new product development or market expansion, all of which could lead to future growth and shareholder value appreciation. Overall, Avalon GloboCare is navigating the challenging landscape of corporate finance by securing essential capital. While the methods might seem technical, they boil down to a company needing funds and finding a willing investor. For shareholders, the focus should remain on how this capital is used and whether it translates into tangible business progress that outweighs the dilution. Alright, that's our breakdown of Avalon GloboCare's latest filing. What's your take on these numbers and what they signal for the company's future? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this analysis was valuable, hitting that like button really helps, and subscribe for more deep dives. Don't forget to check out the Discord in the description. Thanks for watching. See you next time.